Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our Science Symposium on CBD, which is being sponsored by the Center for Research on Ingredient Safety. And we look forward to second day of very interesting presentations. Session 3 is going to focus on risk assessment and health safety. And then our final session, session 4, will focus on regulations surrounding CBD with a focus on consumer products. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to our moderator for session 3, Dr. Jinpeng Li.
Hi, everyone. First, I would like to thank all the speakers and attendees. As Norb mentioned, we have a lot of interesting talks today. So for the session 3, we're going to focus on the risk assessment and health safety of CBD. Excuse me. So before we start, here's some logistics I would like to announce. So we have 3 speakers in this session, and each speaker will have 25 minutes, and with 20 minutes of talk and 5 minutes of Q&A. So for attendees, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function, which you can find in the bottom of the screen. You can submit your questions during the talks, but we will answer the questions at the end of the talk. Alternatively, if you prefer to ask questions verbally, please raise your hand. You can find the function if you click on the participant button at the bottom. You can see the raise hand function. So I will unmute you at the end of the talk so you can ask the question verbally. So due to the time limit, if we can't get to every questions, we will have those questions be answered at the end of the session, where we have a panel discussion, which is about 15 minutes. So all 3 speakers will participate in the panelist discussion. So please submit your questions via QA function or raise your hand during the discussion. So we will have all the, so your question will be answered by the speakers in the panel discussion. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Brad Lampe. Mr. Lampe is a principal toxicologist at the NSF International, where his main role is to evaluate the safety and derive acceptable intake limit of drinking water contaminants. He has over 10 years of experience evaluating food contact materials and assisting NSF clients with regulations pertaining to food additives, dietary supplement ingredients. So today he will give us a talk, and the title is Derivation of Acceptable Daily Intake of Orally Consumed CBD in Adult Consumers, Challenges and Limitations. So Brad, please share your screen, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Jinpeng. And if you give me just 1 minute, let me share my screen, and I'll pull up my slides. Okay, everyone should be seeing my cover slide.
Yes, I can see.
Thank you. Okay, great. So thank you to Norb, and thank you to MSU Chris for inviting me to speak today. The title of my presentation is Derivation of an Acceptable Daily Intake of Orally Consumed Cannabidiol in Adult Consumers, as well as Challenges and Limitations. So it's my pleasure to present our work on CBD risk assessment today. I wanted to start by sharing with you a little bit of information about my organization. My organization is NSF International, and we are a global non-for-profit organization whose primary mission is to protect public health. We specialize in the certification, inspection, and testing industry, and one of our core functions is to facilitate the development of standards to protect food, drinking water, indoor air, dietary supplements, and consumer products. As a member of our chemical risk assessment team, one of the things I'm tasked with doing is to write safety assessments for drinking water contaminants, for food contact substances and food additives, and for dietary ingredients, among others. So one of our general approach to chemical risk assessment is shown on this slide. And as you can see, the primary steps that are involved are to search the literature, to select a key study and critical effect, identify a point of departure, and then adjust that point of departure to come up with an acceptable daily intake for the chemical that we're reviewing. And most of you that are involved with risk assessment is probably familiar with this general sort of process. Many different considerations need to be factored in, such as the quality of the studies, the relevance of the data to humans, the adversity of the effects observed, the strength and the shape of the dose response, as well as the uncertainty. So all of these things sort of factor into the process as we go through it. We also have a very robust external peer review process that we always follow when we do our risk assessments here at NSF, and that's not shown on this slide, but I'll talk about it a little bit towards the end of my talk. So CBD is the active ingredient in an FDA-approved drug, Epidiolex, which is indicated for use in treating epilepsy-related disorders. Therefore, CBD has a very unique data set because it includes very robust data in humans. Because it was the subject of clinical studies that were conducted to support an FDA new drug application. So these clinical studies, which I've summarized on this slide in these 3 different rows, were conducted in patients with various epilepsy-related disorders, including Lennox-Gastaut syndrome or Dravet syndrome. These study subjects were also, sorry about that. These study subjects were also taking other anti-epileptic drugs. Many of these subjects were children, and their mean age ranged from 9 to 16. So as you can see from this slide, these studies were 14 weeks in duration and were conducted in cohorts ranging from 120 to 225 patients. And what you can see from the highlighted text in this slide is that the adverse events in the cohorts that were exposed to 20 milligrams per kilogram per day CBD experienced increased incidence of elevated liver enzyme activity, including alanine aminotransferase and aspartate aminotransferase that were greater than 3 times above the upper limit of normal. In other words, sort of the high end of the normal clinical range. In addition to this, there were various self-reported effects, including GI, effects related to gastrointestinal discomfort, reduced appetite, and increased fatigue. All right. So, having shown you that, let's take a closer look at the elevated liver enzyme data. In this table, we show the frequencies of the ALT elevations at various magnitudes above the upper limit of normal for the pooled data set. In other words, the cumulative data from patients from all 3 clinical studies that I showed you in the previous slide. As background information, it should be noted that these measurements are highly variable from person to person, and elevations that are 3 times above the upper limit of normal may be considered relatively minor from a clinical standpoint. However, when you get to elevations that are 5 times greater or even 8 times greater above the upper limit of normal, then these might be considered a more moderate to severe outcome in a clinical setting. So this analysis shows that the majority of the ALT elevations in the 20 milligram per kilogram per day group were less severe to moderate, and they were ranging from 3 times to 5 times above the upper limit of normal. In other words, very severe, more severe elevations above the upper limit of normal at the 20 milligram per kilogram per day dose group were less frequent. You're seeing more of the moderate increases more frequently. And also notably, when you look at the cohort exposed to only 10 milligrams per kilogram per day CBD, we're really not seeing the elevations compared to placebo that we are in the 20 milligram per kilogram per day dose group. Previously, I mentioned that many of the study subjects were taking other anti-epileptic drugs in addition to CBD in these trials. So it's important to see whether we are seeing, it's important to determine whether we are seeing these liver enzyme elevations in patients taking other anti-epileptic drugs as well. So according to the data that I'm showing on this slide, patients who took CBD and valproate concurrently were much more likely to experience the elevated liver enzymes compared to patients taking 20 milligrams per kilogram per day CBD, but not valproate. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to determine from the available FDA CDER reports whether these patients were taking any other anti-epileptic drugs besides valproate. So there is a little bit of uncertainty here, but it does suggest that valproate and maybe other anti-epileptic drugs seems to play a role in what's happening here. In addition to the liver enzyme activities, it's also important to look at the self-reported effects as well when we're trying to evaluate overall safety. So in this slide, we're looking at the frequency. I'm showing 2 tables. In the top one, we're looking at the frequency of self-reported effects that were rated as severe. And then in the bottom table, we're looking at the frequency of self-reported effects in patients when they're stratified by concurrent valproate administration. So we see that the frequency of the self-reported effects that were rated as severe in the top table is slightly elevated in the 20 milligram per kilogram day dose group compared to placebo. And then when you look at the bottom slide, we also see that the frequency of self-reported effects is higher among patients administered CBD and valproate compared to CBD alone. So you're still seeing some of these effects in the patients taking only CBD but not valproate, but you're seeing much more of these self-reported effects when they're taking both drugs. Okay, so just a brief summary of what I've discussed so far. Again, when we look at the Epidiolex data, we see that there's an apparent increased incidence in ALT and AST elevations above the upper limit of normal. But the severe elevations are less frequent than the more minor, less severe elevations. And increases in self-reported effects were observed, but they were mostly low severity. There was a slight uptick in the severe self-reported effects, but they were pretty low frequency. Also, elevated ALT and incidence of self-reported effects were less pronounced among the patients that were not taking concurrent valproate, but it's unclear if the potential toxicity can be fully explained by other anti-epileptic drugs, because we're still seeing some of this in patients that were only taking CBD. We're just seeing it a lot less frequently than those who are taking other anti-epileptic drugs as well. So in addition to the human data, the CBD data set also includes a wealth of toxicity data in animals. Now, some of these studies were part of the FDA NDA submission for Epidiolex, whereas others were published in the peer-reviewed literature. So in this table, I've shown you a snapshot of these, of some of these animal studies. This list isn't all inclusive, but it does give you an idea of what we're seeing in some of the animal studies. And as shown in the highlighted text, many of these studies have reported liver effects similar to humans. These liver effects were mild to moderate in nature, and they also include elevated liver enzymes, increased liver weight, and some minor to moderate histopathological effects. Excuse me, sorry about that. And in addition to this, I also wanted to point out in this slide that there was a reproductive toxicity study that was conducted in mice, which is shown at the top row, as well as a developmental toxicity study in rabbits, shown in the second row. So what's noteworthy is that in mice that were exposed to CBD for 34 days, they did report some reproductive effects. These were male mice, and they saw reduced fertility rates and reduced number of offspring when exposed to CBD. There was also increased incidence of sperm head abnormalities. So there were some effects in male mice exposed for 34 days to 30 milligrams per kilogram per day. In addition, in one of the Epidiolex animal studies, this was conducted in rabbits, they were exposed to 125 milligrams per kilogram per day. They saw some effects indicative of maternal toxicity. And they also saw some minor fetal effects, including reduced fetal body weight and increased incidence of reduced ossification in the pups. But when we consider human and animal studies, we also have to consider the potential toxicokinetic differences. And this is sort of a brief slide showing a grossly oversimplified metabolic pathway, but it does show you the CBD parent compound on the left, as well as what we might consider the two main metabolites, which include the hydroxyl and the carboxylic acid moieties of CBD, which are produced by the cytochrome P450 induction pathways. And in this slide, I'm showing you data from the FDA's new drug application CEDAR reviews. And these data show that internal doses for the CBD parent compound, as measured by blood plasma area under the curve, is much lower for humans, which is shown in the red lines, than for animals, which is shown in the blue lines. However, these data for humans cover only a very small range of doses and very short exposures. So we have to take this data with a little bit of a grain of salt, but it does give you an idea of what these differences might look like. And in this slide, I'm showing you the AUC data for the metabolite, one of the metabolites, the carboxylic acid metabolite. In this case, again, humans have much higher exposure than animals. But similarly, the human data cover only a very short exposure window, and we only have data for 2 doses, but it does suggest that humans have a much higher exposure to this metabolite than animals. So these toxicokinetic data suggest considerable interspecies differences in metabolism, and gives us confidence that we should give the human data higher weight when it's available. Another wrinkle to throw into this is that when you're looking at it is a recent study from Taylor et al. Published a couple of years ago. And this team looked at, internal doses measured by AUC and Cmax amongst human subjects given a single CBD dose of 1,500 milligrams. And they compared this out, and they compared internal doses amongst people exposed in a fasted state versus people exposed in a fed state. And they found that among human subjects that consumed a high-fat meal prior to their CBD dose, there was a significantly higher degree of bioavailability and absorption in the fed state compared to the fasted state. And this may have implications when we look at the Epidiolex trials, because we don't really know. We know that some of those subjects were on a ketogenic diet, but the FDA didn't report how many. They also didn't report whether these subjects were in fed versus fasted states when they consumed their CBD drug regimens. And so it would be helpful to know in future trials whether subjects were in a fed or a fasted state, because that clearly has implications for bioavailability. Okay, now that I've given you all this information, let me go back to our general risk assessment approach and sort of summarize where we're at with everything. So when we wrote our final risk assessment, we identified our key study. That was the pooled data from the Epidiolex clinical studies. As I mentioned, there were 3 clinical studies, and we get pretty robust data when we pool all of these data together. The critical effects or the liver toxicity as indicated by elevated serum ALT and AST levels, as I mentioned before. And these were accompanied by increased frequency of self-reported effects. Our point of departure is 10 milligrams per kilogram per day, as we saw these effects in patients taking 20 milligrams per kilogram per day, but not 10 milligrams per kilogram per day. And then we also apply an uncertainty factor of 300-fold. The reason we do this is because we have to account for numerous sources of uncertainty in our risk assessment, including the intraspecies uncertainty, or the fact that certain people, particularly people with compromised liver function, may be more susceptible to the effects of CBD than healthy consumers. We also have to account for the lack of data on chronic use. So the clinical trials were only 14 weeks in duration, but we don't know how these effects might be exacerbated with a chronic exposure duration. Lastly, we have to consider that we don't really have a complete database, and this is particularly related to reproductive and developmental toxicity. We have evidence that there may be reproductive effects in mice and developmental and maybe mild developmental effects in rabbits, but we don't know how this might translate to human exposure. And we don't have a good multi-generational reproductive toxicity to really get a handle on whether effects might carry over to multiple generations. So when we calculated our final acceptable daily intake, we took our point of departure of 10 milligrams per kilogram per day divided by the 300-fold uncertainty factor, and we come up with an acceptable daily intake of 2 milligrams per day, assuming a 70-kilogram person. Now, if we could modify this, if we assume that the consumer is only going to use this, a CBD product, for a short period of time, a relatively short period of time, in that case, we can consider an alternate acceptable daily intake where we remove that subchronic duration factor, and we only divide the 10 milligrams per kilogram per day by 30 to get an acceptable daily intake of 20 milligrams per day, assuming a 70-kilogram person. I just want to briefly mention our Health Advisory Board external review process. The risk assessment that we conducted was reviewed by an external review panel consisting of experts from a variety of institutions and agencies. And we have presented this assessment twice to the full HAB, and we've also presented this assessment to HAB subpanels as well as we've worked through these issues. And so this is just to show you that our assessment has undergone a significant vetting process. We've also presented this assessment to the FDA's CBD working group as well as to MSU CRIS back in February. Lastly, I just want to briefly discuss the data gaps that we do have. The 20 milligram per day dose might seem pretty low compared to what we know humans are already consuming. And I want to emphasize that our ADI doesn't mean that 20 milligrams, that doses in excess of 20 milligrams per day is unsafe. It just means that there's a lot that we don't know, and our acceptable daily intake reflects that. We don't know whether these liver enzyme elevations are relevant to healthy consumers because we have clinical trials in people that are suffering from antiepileptic conditions and they're taking other drugs that may exacerbate these effects. We also don't know the effects of chronic exposure. We also don't know whether these male reproductive effects in mice are relevant to humans. We don't really know what the toxic moiety is. We know that mice may metabolize CBD differently, but we don't know what the toxic moiety is. So all of these factors contribute to the uncertainty. With that, I'd like to conclude my presentation today, and I'll take any questions now or at the during the panel session at the end of this, at the end of the next couple of talks. And thank you for your attention and allowing me to speak today.
Thank you, Brad. That's a very nice talk. I saw a couple of questions coming from the Q&A and also one question from the raising hand, but given the time, we want to stay on schedule. I will ask, we will save those questions to the end of the session, so we'll have those answered in the panel discussion. Thank you, Brad. So so you may now stop sharing the screen now.
Yes.
For our next speaker is Mr. Patrick McCarthy. Mr. McCarthy is an accomplished